John chapter 1. This is verses 14 through 18. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only God, who is at the Father's side, has made him known." So twice in that passage, John describes Jesus as full of grace and truth. I want to suggest today that a great deal of the challenges and the heresies that the church has endured, particularly of late, is a result of our failure to hold these two together. And I think quite often we get enamored with one of those words and tend to treat the second word almost like the embarrassing uncle. I am, in fact, an embarrassing uncle, so I know what it's like. But I think, for instance, one group might say, yes, the Bible contains some troubling passages about hell, sin, and the devil, but we're not really going to talk about those, because really the heart of the gospel is love and grace. Right? The other side might say, yes, the gospel is good news, but man, have you seen how the world is going to hell in a handbasket? And there's almost, in that second one, there's almost a satisfaction in the fact that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. So there's a holding on to the truth, but there seems to have been a neglect or a diminishment of grace. I want to suggest to you that in elevating one and neglecting the other, we in fact distort both. I want to also suggest to you that it's only in holding these two together that we can maintain a true Christian witness. So what does it mean? What is the result of attempting to elevate grace and neglecting truth? Well, I want to say that perhaps the first thing that happens is a removal of meaning, or telos, if you want, or an end, or what is a flourishing, human flourishing, right? If we are diminishing truth and trying to elevate grace, then we necessarily, I think, have forgotten or gotten rid of a sense of what it means to truly flourish as a human being. And so when you get rid of that understanding that life does have a meaning or a purpose, then love, and I'll use the words love and grace somewhat interchangeably, but the idea that love becomes merely acceptance. And I think this comes from our culture around us. It's very easy for us to be swayed into changing what I believe the understanding of love in the Bible is, that love is seeking what is best for the other. Whereas I think in our culture, love is accepting the other as they are. And then the result of that is that tolerance becomes the primary virtue, right? If you have taken away meaning, purpose, right, then there isn't a right way, so to speak, to live. Then what's left is we just all have to get along, right? And tolerance is that real virtue that helps us get along, right? But if you remove truth and try to do grace without truth, I think what you end up with is tolerance as perhaps the primary, if not the only virtue. And in the end, I think this devolves into what some people have called moralistic therapeutic deism, which is a term coined, well, I read it in Rob Dreer's book, which I don't know if is original to him, but this is how he defined it. There exists a God who created and orders the universe. God wants people to be good, nice, and fair. The central goal is to be happy and feel good about oneself. God makes little to no demands on the believer, and good people go to heaven when they die. This is moralistic therapeutic deism. Now, the problem, I would argue, with moralistic therapeutic deism is that if we are honest with ourselves, it doesn't provide hope, right? Imagine for a moment that you have a bubble over your head that tells everybody around you what your every thought is, right? If that was to happen to any of us, I think we would all go run and hide and stay in our room so that nobody would see us that day, right? That's an indication that we know we're not the kinds of people we would like to be, right? That our thoughts betray us in that sense. And so we're actually not happy in acquiescence. We want something bigger, something greater. We want transformation. We want to be the kind of people who wouldn't be ashamed of what they're thinking, right? And so grace without truth, grace without the cross, in some sense, prevents that prevents that hope. Bonhoeffer describes it very well, and he termed it cheap grace. He says, cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. Right? So it's forgiveness without repentance because there's nothing to repent of. It's baptism without church discipline because the church doesn't need to hold people to account, right? It's communion without confession. These are things that go the wayside if you attempt to hold grace without truth. Conversely, let's think about truth without grace, and this too is we're well aware of, or we see quite frequently. And I would argue that when you look in Scripture, when Jesus' time, this was the greater error, or the more common error. Every era has its own bent, so to speak. I think the modern church is more likely to err on the side of grace without truth. I think the church in Jesus' time was more bent to err on the side of truth without grace. And so you see a lot of it in his interactions with the Pharisees in particular. I think truth without grace devolves into rules, rules that often lack compassion. So we remember Jesus' discussions with the Pharisees over the Sabbath, and how he points out that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Trying to help them understand that the rules were there for people to help them flourish and not to be a straitjacket to prevent them from flourishing. I think truth without grace also devolves into self-righteous denunciation. Think about the woman caught in adultery that is brought to Jesus, and they are about to stone, right? And he says to them that he who is without sin cast the first stone, right? Again, he's trying to bring them back to some understanding, some empathy, some grace that they've forgotten in their holding on to the truth of the law. Similarly, I think majoring in the details and ignoring or missing the main point. So in Matthew 23, when Jesus confronts the Pharisees in perhaps his most strongest words, he accuses them of tithing down to the spices, but then forgetting about justice, mercy, and these bigger things. He says, you should have done the latter, the former, but without neglecting the bigger things of justice and mercy. And finally, I think truth without grace devolves into anger. And so truth becomes a cudgel or a hammer by which we defeat our enemy. And we've all, I think, seen videos of protesting Christians who are screaming in anger. And rightfully, I think we are horrified by that. But I don't think these people believe themselves to be, they're genuinely Christian, I think, some of these people. But they have come to so elevate truth over grace that they've distorted truth, distorted what the gospel truth is and what it's attempting to do. And again, it's so if we're going to talk about truth and grace together, if we're going to keep them together, now the question is, how do we do that? What does it look like if we keep truth and grace together? That's not an easy one to describe. And I think, again, as we often do as Christians, if we're going to look at an example, we look at the person of Jesus and how he lived this out. And again, the story of the woman caught in adultery is a fantastic example, where after he says that he is without sin, cast the first stone, and everybody leaves, and he's left with the woman, and he looks at her and says, "Have they all gone?" And she says, "Yes." And he says, "Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No one." And he says, "Then neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more." Right? So there, Jesus again is he's not diminishing her sin. He's not trying to excuse her sin, but neither is he condemning her, right? Grace and truth held together. A more challenging one is the way that Jesus interacts with the Pharisees. And if you read some of the passages, and Matthew 23 comes to mind most easily, then it's often very harsh. I mean, he doesn't mince his words, right? But neither did he turn away from Nicodemus, right, when he came to him, right? Jesus can speak some very hard words to the Pharisees, but as I'll talk about later, his end goal was never to denounce, but to save, right? I'm going to try this. I don't know if it'll work. If it doesn't work, no big deal. But I'm going to try to play something for you. Oh, shoot. Except it's disappeared, so it may not work. I had it set up, and then the computer had to restart, so it disappeared on me. Well, yeah, so it may take too long to reset it up. So it's a passage from I don't know if you've ever seen Matthew. There's a wonderful rendition of the book of Matthew, word for word rendition. And it's Matthew 23, where Jesus does confront the Pharisees. So let me see if this works. So do you see the play button? Yeah, okay. And now I think there's something in Zoom I have to do to make you be able to hear it.
You might have to stop sharing and then open sharing up again, and then click the little button on the bottom of the sharing when you go back in again. So now if you hit share.
Yeah. Now it's in the more here, and I can share sound. There we go. Okay, let's see if this works.
Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides! You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee! First clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside they're full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our forefathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the sin of your forefathers. You snakes! You brood of vipers! How will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so, upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. I tell you the truth, all this will come upon this generation. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate.
So I hope you could hear that all right. Yeah, okay. I don't know if I need to do something to. Can you hear me all right now? Okay. Okay. I love that that portrayal of Jesus, because it portrays his heart in the midst of those very harsh words, right? And he's not mincing his words. He's not trying to water down what he's saying, but the way he's saying it in that passage and the way that that's depicted demonstrates the desire in his heart just to shake them out of their heresy, shake the Pharisees out of their self-righteousness, right? And he has to use hard words to do it, or to attempt to do it at least. Again, it's the words of Bonhoeffer that I come back to. It says, costly grace is a treasure hidden in a field, for the sake of which a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It is the pearl of great price, to buy which the merchant will sell all his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out the eye which causes him to stumble. It is the call of Jesus Christ, at which the disciple leaves his net and follows him. Costly grace is the gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it costs us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it costs God the life of his Son. Ye are bought with a price, and what has cost God cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price for our life. I want to note, I hope it's clear already, that what is suggested here is that truth, grace and truth is not a balancing act, right? We're trying to temper truth with grace, or fortifying grace with truth, right? Rather, grace without truth quickly ceases to be grace, and truth without grace loses its significance. For the former, right, for those who try to take grace without truth, the church, I think, quickly becomes a social gathering where we're all trying to be nice to one another, but we really have nothing in common, right, that binds us together. For the latter, one begins to really wonder why they're holding on to truth so tenaciously, because it really doesn't make them happy, right? And so in both these cases, I think you see the downside or the inevitable consequences of sundering these two words apart. I think I want to argue that we need to hold to both passionately and fully, and if you try to divorce the one from the other, you end up with neither. There must be, I think, a firmness verging on hardness to grace, stemming from a firm commitment to truth. Jesus' go and sin no more. This was not a compromised position he had. I think if we're not careful, we will allow the culture to change what we mean by love and by grace, so that it becomes a matter of just accepting others as they are, rather than wanting the best for the other. Scripture holds to a very specific understanding of what the best is, what human flourishing looks like. And if we jettison it, then how do we continue to hold onto an understanding of human flourishing, right? Which means, how do we understand what grace means? One of my favorite authors, who I know you've heard about from other people, George MacDonald, he wrote, "When we say that God is love, do we teach men that their fear of him is groundless? No, as much as they fear will come upon them, possibly far more. The wrath will consume what they call themselves, so that the selves God made shall appear." I love that line. The wrath will consume what they call themselves, so that the selves God made shall appear. There's a definite form to the grace that God provides to us. It is defined by the truth that is our end. We are designed, created for a purpose. And thus, to desire what is best for the other is to desire that they would fulfill that purpose for which they were created. We cannot want the best for the other without holding on to an idea of what that best is. And if human flourishing is defined by God's character, then it has a definite shape. And thus, to love the other is to help them to seek that flourishing. So grace without truth, therefore, ceases to be grace because it ceases to be good news. Again, to quote George MacDonald, "You must be strong in my strength," he imagines God saying, "and blessed in my blessedness, for I have no other to give you." What God offers us isn't a whatever you want, let's all just get along. It's this is what it looks like to be human. This is what it looks like to be a child of God. And if we don't hold on to that truth of the gospel, then we are like the prophets who said, peace, peace, when there was no proof, peace. An example of that for me is a story my father-in-law told me once. He was a United Church minister for many years, and when he went through seminary, he was already this was a second career for him, so he was a bit older. But when he went through seminary, there was one of the professors asked anybody to put their hand up if they felt that homosexuality was a sin. He was the only one in his class who put up his hand. Many weeks, I think even maybe months later, he had a knock on his door, and standing at his door was the most overtly homosexual person in the seminary. And he asked to talk to my father-in-law, and they came in and they chatted for a while. And eventually my father-in-law was like, well, why do you want to talk to me? He said, well, everybody around me is telling me that what I'm doing is great, and they're affirming me, and I know in my heart it's not. And you're the only one I know who will talk to me about that. Right? So there was grace, and so we had a chance to talk with him, and a chance to hold grace and truth together. Similarly, I think there must be a kindness to truth. Just like there must be a firmness to grace, there must be a kindness to truth that seeks to reveal or confront only as a means to heal. One of my favorite poems is a poem called The Hound of Heaven by a guy called Francis Thompson. And I won't quote the whole poem, it's very, very long. But essentially the whole poem is about a guy running away from God. And everything he tries to put his energy into ends up betraying him, so to speak. And he ends up feeling betrayed and despondent. So he, at the end of the poem, God finally speaks to him. And he says to him, all which I took from thee, I did but take, not for thy harms, but just that thou might seek it in my arms. All which thy child's mistake fancies as lost, I have stored for thee at home. Rise, clasp my hand and come. Halts by me that footfall. Is my gloom after all shade of his hand outstretched caressingly? Ah, fondest, blindest, weakest, I am he whom thou seekest. Thou dravest love from thee, who dravest me. Again, a recognition that God's, even the harshness of God is in fact driven by a love for us. And that similarly, us too, when we have to say, and sometimes we do have to say harsh things, we should do so in a way or with a desire or motivated by charity or love for the other. I think if we hold grace and truth together, I think we avoid what I would consider the two most common errors in the way that we interact with our culture around us. On the one side, we have a compromise position. So our practice of grace begins to look very much like a compromise. And I think we should take pause if all of our thinking seems to align naturally with the culture around us. Jesus certainly didn't anticipate that would be the case. And if all our thinking is aligning with the culture around us, we ought to think carefully about whether we have not begun to compromise. On the other side, has our commitment to truth begun to harden our hearts? It's easy to fall into a bunker mentality where you think we as Christians have the truth and everybody out there is wrong, right? And we get this us-them mentality that can be very, very damaging to any Christian witness, right? So again, it's holding those two together, grace and truth, that prevents us from doing both, committing either of those errors. I'm a little worried that I'm going to run out of battery, but we'll see. I may have to run and get my cord in a minute. But, so how do we hold the two together? Very quickly. I think first off, we need to make a commitment to truth. And that means a commitment to do the hard work. Understanding or figuring out what the truth is not an easy thing. We shouldn't expect it to be easy. I don't know how much time you spend in your studies, but do you spend a similar amount of time making sure that you understand the truth of the gospel? Augustine of Hippo said, "It will not be held against you that you are ignorant against your will, but that you neglect to seek out what it is that makes you ignorant." I think sometimes we think we just throw up our hands and say, "I can't know the truth, so I'm just not going to make a decision. I'm just not going to hold a position." And I don't think that is an option for us. And why? Well, it's Paul in Romans 12 saying, "Do not be conformed to the world around you, but be transformed." How? By the renewal of your mind, right? We have to renew the mind. We have to be thinking. We have to be thinking through what we believe. So here are some questions for you, and to know whether you've asked these questions yourself. Where did I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? How do I make sense of suffering? What can I know? And how do I define justice? If you haven't taken the time to think these through, I would suggest that you do so. And you know what? I'm even going to put a plug in for you. Take a year off. Go to Augustine College for a year, and we'll give you a year to think through these questions, and we'll help you through it. Augustine College is a one-year program in Ottawa, in which we discuss, or we introduce you to the thinkers of the Christian past, right? The modern church sometimes, I think, forgets that there's a host of people who have come before us who have thought deeply about these questions. And we're starting from fresh, as if all these people before hadn't come, because we don't know them. We don't know what they thought and how they wrestled with these questions. It's crazy. We have this wealth of knowledge, of wisdom that's been passed down to us, and we're completely ignoring it, right? So take a year, come to Augustine College, learn about these thinkers from the past, let them help you understand how to answer these questions. Okay, sorry, Sid, I had to do that. Secondly, be ruthlessly honest with yourself. Okay, seek to engage with people who think differently from you. Echo chambers are a real problem in our culture. It's easy to find people who think just like us. So be engaged with people who think differently from you. And make sure you do so with argument and not with demonization. If there's anything that worries me more about our culture, is the fact that argument is being replaced by demonization. We quickly label people, we quickly dismiss them with terms, with labels, rather than listening to them. And it's important to remember that an argument is not a quarrel. Chesterton wrote, "Perhaps the principal objection to a quarrel is that it interrupts an argument." If you look at the word argument, it comes from a few Greek words: argutus, clear, bright, distinct, or penetrating; argumentum, Latin, evidence or proof; and arguo, to prove or reveal. Okay? So when you think about an argument, it's not two people in a battle, right? It's two people together seeking the truth, right? And if you think of it that way, it really does have implications about how we argue, right? What stance or attitude is more likely to help us to discover the truth together? And then don't neglect coherence and logic. Okay. My department is thinking about getting rid of the only logic course we teach our students, which I think is a terrible idea. Logic should be taught all the way through high school, but we don't do that either anymore. Go back and learn some logic if you haven't taken logic. Learn at the very least, learn the informal fallacies, right? So that you can figure out how to combat them. So, because if there isn't logic, if there's no rational means to convince one another, what remains? Well, all that remains is the will of the majority, intimidation, trickery, and subterfuge. And all three of those are some form of the imposition of power. This is why postmodernism is so cynical. It has nothing left. It has debunked logic, and the only thing left is intimidation, the will of the majority, or subterfuge. So a commitment to logic, I would argue, is in fact the only means to avoid tyranny. Note, however, that a commitment to logic means a willingness to accept that we could be wrong, particularly when logic demonstrates an incoherence in our thinking. So think about what you believe. What are the contradictions in your thinking? What are the logical consequences of your beliefs? And can you live with those consequences? This is all about the commitment to truth. And I'm going to run. I'll be back in 1 minute when I get my cord.
Now, one of the challenges is I don't think I can stop. Oh, no, I can stop. I do have power. I think we've all been in this situation where we've run out of a battery power. It's good to know what happens to professors as well as to students.
Actually,
you know?
I was in a talk the other day, and the guy had to do that, and he gave us a tour of his house as he went and found his cord. Anyway, did I stop sharing in the process?
I stopped sharing just to pause, so
Okay.
you can take it back again.
Okay, I will go quickly through the remainder because I think I've talked long enough. I want to suggest to you that commitment to truth does not mean a search for certainty. And I think sometimes we get paralyzed in believing we have to know for sure before we can do anything. So I want to dispel that. Paul said, now we know in part. I think we need to move forward with what I would call a humble confidence, okay? Fully cognizant that we could be wrong, but also knowing that the truth must be committed to if it is to be truly grasped. Jesus said as much to us. In John, he says, if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether my teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. Jesus is, in other words, saying, try to live as if I am who I say I am. Live as if I am, and see if you don't get the certainty you're looking for. But you don't get that certainty if you don't try, right? So there has to be a certain amount of living it out before the certainty arrives. You can see this even in the story of Moses. I love the example God gives. When Moses asked for a sign, do you remember the sign he gets given? It's, when you have brought them out of Egypt, you will worship me again on this mountain. If I was Moses, I'd have been like, wait a second, God, I want the sign now before I do the hard work, not after, right? But that's not the way it works, right? The certainty comes after we've at least made the effort. So having committed to truth, we then engage with grace. Remember that there is a firmness to grace. We are not meant to be timid Christians, but neither are we meant to be angry Christians. So let charity and the good of the other be your motivation. And think about it, in defending the truth, what is your aim? Is it to be right? Is it to justify yourself? Or is it to seek the good of the other? In doing this, I think questions are often more helpful than statements, perhaps. But most importantly, you need to hear the other. If the person you're talking to thinks that you're just waiting to jump in with your point, they're not going to hear you, and you're not hearing them really. Pick your battles. Remember Paul in Jerusalem? He didn't go out of his way to cause trouble, right? He tried to do as much as he could to please the Judaic Christians who were there, but he also knew when to stand up, right? So remember when Peter pulled away from eating with the Galatians, or was it the Corinthians? I can't remember. And Paul confronted him to his face and said, this is wrong what you're doing, right? So we need to know when we need to stand forward. And this is the tough part, is knowing when we need to say those hard things. I think we've come to believe that we cannot say things that might hurt and still be grace-filled, but that's not true. And I think Sid and I both have kids. You guys are too young to have kids. Once you have kids, you know that sometimes you need to say things to them that they're not going to like to hear. Right, and that's true, but how we say them is so very important, right? At the end of the day, we need to be confident in the message that we bring, that we have a hope to offer to the world, and if we are too timid to speak out because we're afraid of being wrong or we're afraid of not being grace-filled, then we're never going to make a witness. Right? That what I'm attempted to do today is simply put some parameters around what that witness looks like, and to demonstrate, hopefully trying to demonstrate to you how we go wrong in that witness, and how remembering those two words, grace and truth, can I, in my own life anyway, it's helping me realize how I can best be a witness to those in my department in particular. So anyway, I'll stop there. Probably talked longer than I should have anyway, so I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let's jump into any Q&A, some questions that you might have for Dr. Patrick. I'll open the floor to whoever wants to jump in first.
I thought that your presentation was really good. Like it flowed really well. And when you first presented the idea of like grace without truth or truth without grace, I think those were really clear. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share those slides.
Sure. Yeah. I'd be happy to do that.
And I also had a question.
Sure.
So you talk about having kids and telling them truth and things to do. For me personally, I've encountered two different sets of elevations of truth and elevations of grace. My experience of an elevation of grace is in teachers college, where teachers are encouraged to have their students, you do you and flourish, assess in a way where everyone does well. And yes, everyone is unique in their own way, that has their own experiences and values. And there's no such thing as like a better way to live. I think is a message that teachers colleges try to encourage teachers to share to their students. And I think I also get it because, students come from a wide variety of backgrounds. Another experience I have is the Christian Legal Fellowship, which is like an NGO advocacy group that tries to inform policy in a way that reflects their moral ideas, right? They try to limit people's behavior in accordance with their understanding of truth. And I also find that like when you force people to behave a certain way, especially through law, you don't actually communicate with them, and you just undermine their sense of freedom and mobility, and it becomes an idol, right? Once I have access to the thing that is restricted from me, then I will feel fulfilled. And so I see the Christian Legal Fellowship as something that emphasizes truth over grace. So I guess like with your own kids, like when they do things or have different beliefs or have an alignment of truth for themselves that differs from you, like what's the degree that you try to dictate their behavior or encourage them to do whatever they want?
Well, let me first off confess that as a parent, I used to think I was patient until I had kids. So I have had many humbling experiences of not holding grace and truth together very well as a parent. It's reinforced to me how important it is to hold them together, but it's also humbled me in recognizing just how difficult it is to do so. I haven't, my eldest is 17, I haven't had a rebellious child yet, so I haven't had much to deal with in terms of serious differences in belief. That may still come. I'm not blind to the fact that it may, so I don't have too much experience yet of that with my own kids. I've watched my sister go through that, and it's tough. I mean, to hold the truth out to them at all costs, while at the same time demonstrating to them in ways that you love them and care for them, right? But I think the danger, again, if you go back to those two dangers, the one danger is to say, okay, we're going to accept you for who you are, and we're not going to hold the truth. We're not going to hold you to any standard anymore. We're not going to hold to you a vision of what the human flourishing looks like anymore. We're going to allow you to decide what you think human flourishing should be. Right? And then the other side is we're going to kick you out of the house because you know what? You don't hold to the truth anymore, right? So I think there is a means of holding those two together by holding the truth out to them, but in a way that still keeps them close, right? It's tough. But I look at that portrayal of Jesus in Matthew and how he shouted at the Pharisees trying to get it through them. But anybody watching it can see that his desire is for them to turn, right? And I think with my own kids, I think they forgive a lot of when I get impatient with them, because they know that my heart desires what's best for them, right? Even if they may disagree what the best looks like, the fact that they know that's in my heart gives me the latitude to say things to them that otherwise they might take offense at. I don't know if that is an answer to your question, but I do think that if you are able to demonstrate love, then people will accept hard words from you more readily.
If I could add, you began with John chapter 1 and Jesus being full of grace and truth. It always strikes me that the very heart of Christianity and the incarnation of God, that God meets us where we're at, that he enters into relationship with humanity, is a demonstration of grace and truth in terms of what it even looks like. That is something that we're called to model with one another. Like even with my kids, anytime we're discussing truth, it's done in relationship with them. It's because the truth we're talking about is also embodied in the sharing of meals and playing outside and going for a walk, and there's all these other aspects to the relationship. And I think that is an important component of holding the tension of grace and truth with the culture at hand too, is what does it mean for us to be in relationship with people and with situations? Because we could fundamentally disagree with one another, but if we have relationship, it allows for the healthy argument, as Jonathan was talking about earlier, to carry on, because we recognize something in the character of love that we would even have for one another. And I think that principle applies to familial situations, collegial situations, friendship situations. Grace and truth is done best in relationship, and that's what Jesus Christ embodies.
There's a hand from Min.
Yes. So I wanted to ask, as a professor in a non-religious institution, what do you think the balance should be for professors and people of the university between grace and truth? How should professors be with, obviously they have to be truthful with their teaching, but how much grace do you think should be coming in an academic sense?
Are you talking about in the classroom or outside of the classroom?
Probably more in the classroom, because that's what I have more experience with, but
yeah, I mean, it's distressingly easy to be different in the classroom in one sense, in that a simple just demonstrating a real interest in your students, I am amazed how often that is shocking to my students. And it's saddening to me that that's shocking to my students, because it shouldn't be. That should be the norm. But I think you can demonstrate a fair bit of grace simply by showing a real desire to see your students succeed in a class. But again, grace has nothing to do with being a pushover. So as a professor, I have no desire to give in to constant demands for extensions on exams or anything like that. That to me is not grace. That's just being a pushover. So so there's that. And also, I think outside of the classroom, in my interactions with my colleagues, again, it's distressingly easy in some ways to be different, just by showing a genuine interest, right? and actually hearing the other. It's also distressingly easy to join the flow, and there's so much politics is everywhere. So people get in conflicts and then they take sides, and I think one of the reasons why in the sermon in the Beatitudes, right, you get, I don't know if you've noticed the sequential nature of the Beatitudes, right? Poverty of spirit, recognizing your sinfulness, mourning for your sin, and then you're comforted. Meekness, which is actually not weakness. Meekness is apparently the Greek word is the same word as used for a horse that's been broken and is ready to be ridden into battle. So it's under control, right? That's what meekness is about. The hunger and thirst for righteousness is a natural consequence of becoming the kind of person who is being comforted, receive forgiveness. And then you get the three characteristics: pure in heart, peacemakers, and merciful, right? And so when you think about those three words and how embodying those three words in our interactions with other people, why are Christians called to be peacemakers? Well, hopefully because we are pure in heart, meaning that we're not double-sided. We don't say one thing to one person and one thing to another, right? So people can trust us, right? Which allows us to be peacemakers. So that's my goal. I want to be a trustworthy person by God's grace. I hope that I can be a trustworthy person in my department so that people will see me as a peacemaker. But and again, I want to emphasize it's not a balancing act between truth and grace here, right? But it's holding both of those firmly. I'll give you another example from recently. I was chair of a hiring committee. And it's a CRC, a Canada Research Chair position. And recently, universities have instituted what's called preferential hiring for these Canada Research Chairs. So if you're a member of one of 4 designated groups, then we'll be given your application for the position. And only if we discount all of those will we be allowed to see the other applications for the position, right? So I hesitate to use this example just because I'm bringing up a whole other can of worms, but for my own understanding, and again, I recognize this is part of moving forward in humble confidence, knowing that we could be wrong. My own understanding of that process, that is a deeply unjust process, right? Where you have people applying for the position and they're not being given equal opportunity to get that position. And so, as chair of the committee, I had to struggle with how do I present that view in a way that will be heard and not simply cause people to get their backs up, right? So I thought about it a lot, and eventually I did. I tried to present it, and I presented it first to the person organizing it, and then to the whole committee as a whole, explaining why I couldn't participate in a process like that, right? Which was a process that I felt to be unjust. As it turned out, it didn't matter, and we were able to see all the applications in the end anyway. But it was an opportunity, I think, for me to hold out truth, hopefully in a way that was filled with grace. And thankfully, it didn't end up in anybody getting upset. So.
Thank you.
Other questions? Leanna.
I'm not quite sure if this is a question or if it's just me kind of verbally trying to understand something, but would you say that for a church or an individual that maybe leans more towards truth or leans more towards grace, would you say that they realize that, and that they're like trying to, like that's their goal, like I want to be only truth, I want to be only grace? Or would you say that they are more like they actually are trying to balance? I mean, this is also kind of making it sound like we think that we are the right balance. I mean, I guess we're always striving that humble confidence, like you said. Yeah, I don't know if this is a
Yeah,
question.
no, I don't think anybody sets out to separate those two words. I think what we do is we begin, it's a bit of a slippery slope. We begin by subtle changes in the way that we define words, and emphasize, and it begins with subtle emphases. Really telling is which scripture passages do you focus on as a church, right? This is why going through a book, like when a pastor goes through a book and preaches through the whole book, that's a really good thing, because it prevents you from cherry picking the parts of the Bible that you want to focus on, which prevents us, I think, from becoming too focused on one part and ignoring another part. So yeah, I don't think anybody sets out to do that. I think it just, over time, we begin to emphasize certain parts and we begin to neglect other parts of Scripture. And the end result is we move further and further away from the scriptural story. There was a second part to your question that I was going to respond to, but now it's gone.
Oh man, I can't really remember what I said either.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was the other part I wanted to bring. So one of the things C.S. Lewis says is that in Screwtape Letters, he says that one of the tricks of the devil is to get us to be most concerned about the errors we're least likely to commit. Right. So if, for instance, you look at that Matthew passage and you're uncomfortable with the words Jesus is using, right, then perhaps it's an indication that you're leaning on the side of doing grace without truth, right? Or I'm trying to think of the example. Yeah, my own, and I know my own tendency is to lean towards truth without grace. Partly my upbringing. I have British parents, and they're pretty stiff upper lip type people, and they don't hug very much. And they taught me, and I value what they taught me so much, in terms of they instilled in me what I believe and why I believe it, right? But I do think it does lead to a tendency towards truth without grace. So I have to be careful of that myself, and I think it's helpful to know your own tendencies, and easier to combat where you might go, or where you might go wrong in the process.
Thank you.
I also probably grew up with more grace or truth than grace, but tend to lean towards more grace than truth. However, I do think one of the challenges, and this picks up on what Leanna's talking about, is I come to know a lot of people who feel very strongly about balancing grace and truth, and yet they disagree with each other. And I think that often I find to be the more challenging. Not always challenging. I think sometimes it's just healthy, but is what do you have when you have the fact that people are holding strongly to truth and grace, and the next person is holding strongly to truth and grace, and yet they're not coming to the same conclusions.
Yeah, well, this is part of our we know in part, right?
Yeah.
None of us have a handle on the truth, right? And so we are going to disagree, and we can disagree genuinely. I don't think it's, and that's fine. Sid and I probably disagree on all kinds of things, but I don't doubt Sid's commitment to Christ, right? And that it's part of the goodness, because that it's those people who we disagree with, but who are genuinely committed Christians, who help us, prevent us from going down our own form of heresy, so to speak, right? One of my good friends is a professor of linguistics at Carleton. We disagree vehemently on all kinds of things, especially anything political. But I love hanging out with him because he causes me to think, and he makes sure that I rethink some things that I need to rethink.
Yeah, and I think that's an important principle. Is I have to always be ready to give an accounting for what I believe or what I'm holding to as truth. I think if you haven't done the hard work to think through why you've come to the conclusion you've come to, then you have work to do, and that onus is on you to do that work. But you also have to be ready to enter into a conversation or a discussion with somebody else, and be ready to have your mind changed. Like there's some level in which you have to have a, I may be wrong on this. I have to listen. If we enter into all conversations without any posture of listening, then I think we're also in a position where we're not at all being graceful because we're just being arrogant.
Yeah.
So that's part of the balance. Part of the fun too. I think there's something joyful about that exploration and dialogue that we need to embrace and not feel threatened or under attack as well.
Yeah, it doesn't happen enough, honestly. I grew up in a house where argument was par for the course. And we'd have people come into our house, and particularly my dad would go hammer and tongs at it, and it was great. I loved it. And then I went to university, and I tried to argue with people in the way that I at home, and people were like, "Whoa, don't come on so strong." Like, there's not a natural comfort with strongly held opinions that are argued out, right? And that's very sad, I think, because it's very difficult to hold to the truth when we're not talking about it, right? It's much easier we get in our own little group and we end up veering off into some heresy, honestly, as a result of the fact that we're not arguing it out.
Yeah, I think it's good to have good friendship groups in which you do have differing of opinions. I think that's valuable.
Right? If you don't have a room like this, start making one, because it's great to have friendships amongst people of your own age, your own time, but even that is a subset of Christianity, of the Christian story, right? And we have all kind of blinders on, but just simply because we live now, right? And so if you're not listening or reading the people who have gone before us, you're missing out on other opportunities to have your mind shaped.
Any other questions, or it could just turn into, the two old guys going back and forth about what they think everybody should be doing. John, sorry, Chen, you want to jump in there yet?
Yeah, sorry, I've just been trying to articulate the question I have. But basically, I think it comes down to, do you think you should ever use your truth to inform policy or other people's behavior, like compel their behavior? Because I've had a teacher's college experience that said, everyone do whatever you want and you're all special. And I thought that was wrong. But now I'm in law school and I'm surrounded by different NGOs trying to advocate for laws that will compel people's behavior. And I also think that is that wrong? I do agree with some of the fundamental ideas behind why they want to control people's behavior, but at the same time, I feel like I want people to freely make those decisions, and then suffer, and then
Well, yeah. I mean, you can make an argument to say that all law is a control of behavior, right? So unless you want to live in an anarchy, you have to at least allow for the possibility that it is good to advocate for a certain set of regulations. And again, it's a question of how we advocate for it. I have a lot of respect for the people who know that they're going into a hostile environment, but advocate nonetheless for ways of living or of ways of being as a society that are more in line with Scripture, right? There's nothing wrong with doing that, I would argue, depending, of course, on how you do it, right? again, if we're getting into that us versus them bunker mentality, then I think we need to be worried. But if we're honestly advocating for a Christian position within the public sphere, I think that's really necessary to get people thinking.
It's 7:15, so I think it's probably a good time for us to be wrapping up. But Jonathan, thank you for joining us tonight and stirring some thought about what it means to hold grace and truth. And I think that's important for us to consider as students and as people and working and living in public settings. How do we balance that? So thank you for some of the wisdom that you presented, and I hope that it spurs people on to some further reading and thinking about this subject and how best to do it.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.